I'd like to now introduce our distinguished witnesses, beginning first with Mr. Ian Urbina, who is the director and founder of the Outlaw Ocean Project, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit journalism organization that produces investigative stories about human rights, environmental and labor concerns at sea. Mr. Urbina and his team of international investigative reporters conducted a remarkable historic landmark 4-year investigation both on land and at sea, exposing horrific labor abuses in the global seafood industry attributable to the Chinese Communist Party and how this has tainted the United States seafood supply chain.
Thank you to Chairman Smith and Chairman Merkley, and thank you to the rest of the Commission for inviting me to speak. I'll briefly talk about a 4-year investigation that my news organization, the Outlaw Ocean Project, conducted in collaboration with The New Yorker, focused on China's role in human rights and environmental concerns tied to the world's seafood supply chain. Seafood is a distinct global commodity. It is the world's last major source of wild protein. It is the largest globally traded food commodity by value. Seafood is also harder to track than many other products. It is typically harvested offshore, often on the high seas, where there's limited national jurisdiction and little enforcement of what few murky rules exist. Labor spot checks on ships at sea are rare. These workplaces stay in constant motion. Deckhands are often undocumented. They tend to come from poorer nations. Their access to political capital and legal recourse in the form, say, of lawyers, advocates, journalists, or unions is minimal. And between bait and plate, there are an inordinate number of handoffs of this product. It goes from fishing ship to refrigeration ship to port to processor to cold storage to exporter to U.S. importer to distributor or food service company, and then finally to restaurant, grocery store, or public food pantry, military base, or public school. These many handoffs make it tougher to trace the true origin of the catch and to ensure that there is no forced labor or other environmental crimes in the supply chain. Worse still, the few auditing entities that exist, what certification regimes that have emerged in the private sector, whether they focus on environmental or labor concerns, do a very poor job even at identifying and countering such crimes in these supply chains. China plays a unique role. It is the undisputed superpower of seafood because its distant water fishing fleet, which is to say those vessels in foreign or international waters, is vastly bigger than that of any other country. So too is China's processing capacity. Even seafood caught by U.S. flagged ships in our own waters is often shipped to China to be cleaned, cut, and packaged before being sent back to American consumers. China matters and was the focus of our investigation, not just because it is the global linchpin of seafood production, but also because China is the most opaque of settings, the most prone to illegal fishing practices, and, come to find out, the most dependent on forced labor when it comes to seafood. This forced labor occurs in two distinct realms, at sea and on land, on the fishing ships and in the processing plants. At sea, the problem of forced labor is endemic and varied. Debt bondage, human trafficking, beating of crew, criminal neglect in the form of berry, passport confiscation, wage withholding, denial of timely access to medical care, death from violence. We found a widespread pattern on Chinese ships. The investigation revealed that almost half of the Chinese fleet, 357 of 751 ships we studied, were tied to human rights or environmental violations. On land, the problem of forced labor is deep and consistent, especially after the start of the global pandemic led to severe labor, logistical, and supply chain problems in China. The government there began helping its massive seafood industry keep production and exports up and running. It did so by moving thousands of workers across the country from Xinjiang, a landlocked and subjugated region in the far west, to Shandong, a coastal eastern province in the far east, where much of the seafood infrastructure is based. Most of the global seafood industry is impacted. The investigation found that since 2018, more than 1,000 workers from Xinjiang have been forcibly relocated to at least 10 seafood processing plants in Shandong that supply dozens of major U.S. seafood brands, as well as brands in at least 20 other countries. I need not tell this commission about China's labor transfer programs and the ways in which this state-run effort has been legally defined as state-sponsored forced labor, because the ethnic minorities pressed into service do not have an option to say no to these jobs. I also do not need to remind this commission that under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, there are very clear and strict prohibitions of any products in part or whole being imported to the U.S. that rely on Xinjiang labor. Lastly, I do not need to tell the people gathered here that if credible evidence is brought forward, as I think our investigation has, indicating the existence of Xinjiang labor in a particular supply chain, then this federal law, the UFLPA, puts the onus on industry, on the companies themselves to prove that they do not in fact have Uyghurs or other ethnic minorities Xinjiang labor tied to their products. And until they do, U.S. Customs and Border Protection are supposed to block shipments of this import. U.S. companies responding by simply saying that their partners in China at the plants have reassured them that no forced labor exists in their plants is probably not sufficient evidence that they are free from forced labor. Similarly, relying on social or marine auditing firms that inspected these plants, but by their own admission were not actually looking for the presence of Xinjiang workers, is also not sufficient evidence that they are free from forced labor. The Chinese seafood industry and government has already responded that using Xinjiang workers is not illegal under Chinese law, and that the use of these workers does not constitute forced labor because they receive proper living conditions, a salary, vocational training, and fair treatment. But U.S. seafood companies need to understand that this misses the point. Under U.S. law, any use of Xinjiang workers is deemed illegal because it occurs in the context of a larger government-run and coercive program, and whether these workers are paid or they tell auditors or the state media that they are happy to have the job is not relevant. Think here for comparison of the use of child laborers in other countries, which may be legal or defined distinctly in those nations, but regardless of their laws, it is not legal for those products to come into the U.S. As an aside, I will mention that I'm intentionally refraining for the time being from discussing additional set of processing plants in China that our investigation found tied to U.S. seafood importers and that rely on another form of state-sponsored forced labor, namely North Korean workers. As you know, imports to the U.S. associated with this demographic of forced labor is also strictly prohibited by federal law. We will soon publish more findings about this topic. But for now, I will humbly encourage the public to take a deep look at the broken nature of labor auditing of the seafood industry and why seafood companies have been allowed for too long to operate in a place where they have culpable deniability, because to operate there, they have to agree to not look too hard at thorny issues like human rights. In fairness to the industry, the world was not previously aware of how much Xinjiang labor had tainted the global seafood supply chain. The world was also not aware of how pervasive forced labor on Chinese fishing ships existed as well. That moment has now passed. We now see that hundreds of seafood companies are tied to these Chinese ships and these Chinese factories. The question is, what will industry and government do about it? The laws on the matter, at least in the U.S., are pretty clear. The issue is whether they will be enforced. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Urbina. Bottom line, we believe the situation needs a robust and coordinated response across all federal levels, including DOD. What has been the response from USDA, DOD, which procures so much of this fish for our troops and for the commissaries? I have a commissary in my district, joint bases in my district. I've been to it many times, with others. I don't use it, but I go there when I do base tours. And there they are, around the rack, all this different fish products, which normally would be great. But if it's as it is, sourced through human rights abuse, we got a problem. So I'm just wondering what their initial responses have been. Has there been a response? Because we're going to, we're going to push really hard. I don't care who's in the White House. We want no complicity in human rights abuse. So whoever comes in next, might be the same, it might be Biden again. It just has to change. There's got to be an aggressiveness there that has been sorely lacking.
Thanks for the
Yes.
questions. On the issue of auditing, I would just sort of maybe pull up to altitude and take a big bird's eye view on it, and first start by saying it's important to think of seafood in the way that it's distinct from other products, and remember that there are these two distinct universes where seafood is coming from and processing through. And so when we think about the auditing system and you think about the two universes, the at sea and the on land, it's important to ask, okay, what do the audits look like at sea versus on land? And the at sea audits are non-existent. So when it comes to labor, and that's a huge problem that's easily overlooked because it's the toughest problem to solve. Spot checks on ships and conditions on ships are really a big challenge. So that's one dichotomy I'd put forward. The second one is the question of what kinds of audits we're talking about. Are these marine audits or social audits? So marine audits are largely environmental in focus. They're focused on IUU concerns and these matters. And the private sector has more of an infrastructure for marine audits. They're flawed, deeply flawed, the marine audits, but they exist at least. How to check on the attempted traceability of where the fish is coming from, what gear is being used, what ships, et cetera. When it comes to social audits in the seafood space, there's far less infrastructure. And there are some firms that are doing these social audits, meaning checking on labor issues, but only on processing plants. So that's a second dichotomy I think is important to bear in mind. The next one is China. Audits in the rest of the world versus audits in China. That's another dichotomy to really not forget about. If you're going to operate in China, you got to play by their rules. And the U.S. Business Committee knows that. So do NGOs who are now working there. And those rules are pretty problematic. You can't ask certain questions. You can't say certain things. And so auditing firms and U.S. companies that are operating there know full well when they go in that they can't stay there unless they play by those rules. So there is a bit of a sham in having labor audits through private firms in China because there's this whispered sense that they're not really going to do what even weak auditing is supposed to do. And then the last layer I would go to is whether social audits, labor-focused audits on land in China are even looking for the right things and doing them in the right way. Are they even asking whether or looking for Xinjiang workers? What we found is the answer is no. They were not fluent on the issue of the problem of Xinjiang workers, and they were not looking in the right way for that issue. And then also, are they doing them in a credible way? In other words, are they calling ahead and saying, we're going to show up on Tuesday to check your plant? That's not a real audit because they know to clean things up because the auditor's coming on Tuesday. So these are the layers of questions I'd ask of auditing. And for the most part, the answers we got in our investigation were not hopeful ones.
Director Urbina, thank you for your 4-year study. And in your testimony, you note that you studied some 751 ships. And you've also referred to how difficult that is. What does it mean to study a ship? Like, were 751 boats tracked as to what they were offloading and where they were offloading it, or were these conversations with 751 crews, or how did you go about this very difficult task?
Sure. So again, thinking in bifurcated fashion, at sea, on land. So 3 of the 4 years was really focused on the at sea universe. And our hope was to look at the entire Chinese distant water fleet. That was too big to take on. So we then honed it down to look at the portion of the fleet that we thought was potentially most interesting and illustrative. So we honed in on the squid fleet for a bunch of reasons. The squid fleet in the distant water, squid fleet is in the most interesting places around the world: North Korean waters, coast of West Africa, high seas Falkland Islands, high seas Galapagos. The goal then was to go to those 4 places and lay eyes directly on the vessels and try to talk our way onto the vessels to witness crew, witness conditions, check seafood traceability in their refrigeration, talk to officers and captains, etc. And that was successful in each of those places. We were able to get on vessels. When that didn't work, we interviewed crew through a very old school method of bottle communication. So we would write notes and put them in plastic bottles weighted down with rice and cigarettes and candy. And when the ship would try to leave, when they saw us coming, we would follow them, and I would throw bottles onto the back of the vessel, and the crew, usually the deckhands, the captain was looking forward, the deckhands were facing backwards. They would receive the bottle. Sometimes they wouldn't open it, read it. Other times they would. They'd take the message out. It was written in Bahasa, so Indonesian, because a lot of the crew are Indonesian, Chinese, and English. There would be a pen in there. Sometimes they would scribble responses to the questions back, phone numbers of family back home, pleas for help. They'd put it back in the bottle, throw it back over, we'd pick it up. So that was a labor-intensive process, but very effective in getting interactions with crew. So that was sort of the on-the-water method of reporting. The remote method of reporting was a deep dive on various forms of data, which would allow you to understand where have these ships been, by way of tracking them through satellite technology, et cetera. Are they engaged in sovereignty incursions, so illegal fishing in that form? Or is there a written record in any universe, be it foreign media or state reports or other databases, of dead bodies coming off of these ships, of infractions by these ships? So vacuum in all that you can about the vessels and build a database so that you can identify levels of concern for different vessels, and then connect the supply chain dots from those vessels to refrigeration, to port, to processing plant, to U.S. or European buyer. And so that's the only way you have impact is if you can make it relevant to European and American consumers. And for that, you need the supply chain work. You can just talk about a bad thing happening on a vessel, but no one's going to care unless they realize they're tied. So that was the on-water investigation. The on-land investigation was a whole different, kettle of fish, if you will. And that took a lot of, and this was done by the investigative team at my organization, mining of media reports and cell phone footage by workers from within processing plants, OSI, open source intelligence, to see what you can lay eyes on. That Chinese TikTok, there's a lot of footage of workers chronicling their labor transfer from Xinjiang to Shandong. Here I am on the plane, here I'm arriving at my factory, here I am working, here I am seeing the ocean for the first time. So we mined all of that material to connect the dots to actually figure out how many workers were actually in these plants. And then also a lot of companies have newsletters, which are very candid. Mega parent companies of the seafood processing plants talk very openly about how appreciative they are of the Chinese government helping them fill their labor shortage by transferring workers. And so we mined that material as well, and a number of other materials to build a grid of knowledge about what are the plants that are using Uyghur workers.
It is truly a stunningly expansive project you undertook under incredibly difficult circumstances, and just as you were describing, throwing bottles onto the boats and hoping somebody will open the bottle. You apparently got a lot of bottles thrown back, giving firsthand accounts, and so thank you for elaborating on that. I am really kind of struck by just all of your testimony of how complex and difficult it is to tackle this particular this challenge. One piece that I hadn't anticipated was that U.S. flagged vessels fishing in their own waters ship their produce to China for processing. So immediately it's intermixed. U.S. produced food is intermixed with the Chinese flow. Is that an inevitable piece of the economics of processing because it's so labor intensive, or why is American seafood from U.S. vessels in American waters being shipped to China for processing?
I'll take that one on. Can you hear me okay? Inevitable is the word that I focused on in your question. I think the answer to the inevitable part of your question is no, but it depends. The challenge of solving that problem depends on the type of seafood. So if you look at the history of squid, very labor-intensive, costly, dirty work. And late 80s, early 90s was wholesale shipped to China for the cleaning, processing of it. There is not much infrastructure for processing of squid in the U.S. The challenge that the industry will face for finding alternate places to do that work is going to be tough. Pollock, different story. There are, out of Alaska, at-sea processors who are doing a lot of the processing in U.S. waters, on U.S. vessels for U.S. consumers and avoiding the problem. Can they scale up? I don't know. But really an honest answer would have to look at the type of seafood and then look at how could we encourage processing alternatives that allow industry players to not rely on North Korean or Uyghur-worked factories in China.
One thing, if you could, with respect to enforcement, because I'm in the executive branch, I don't know how long it'll take Congress to enforce better and stronger laws. I know we need them, but I think that there's so much that can be done. What would be your number one ask of the U.S. government in terms of strengthening enforcement of existing laws? So if each of the witnesses wouldn't mind, I would love to hear from you.
I'm going to cheat and answer with multiple small pieces that add up to one. I think that when it comes to enforcement, as the point you made, there's a real problem within the U.S. government about agencies not actually working well with each other. And I know that sounds boring and very Washington-focused, but as I look at this over a decade, it's a huge problem. So you even look at things like trafficking getting introduced as a element within SIMP. The bigger issue is that the agency that oversees SIMP isn't built to be looking at trafficking issues and labor issues. ILAB is, and even state is. But the whole program of SIMP resides under an agency that's a bunch of folks that are really, really strong on fishery issues and marine issues, but not labor issues. But everyone is defensive about their jurisdiction, and therefore there's language in the rule, but not real actual implementation of it. That's got to be fixed, and it's by people in this room. Similarly, threshold issues, say in Customs and Border Patrol, at their own interpretation of WROs, and what is the threshold for a case that might be brought forward. This person was trafficked, here's the evidence. The burden is on NGOs and journalists to do all that work. That's a problem. And then it's handed to Customs and Border, and Customs and Border sometimes their lawyers will say, okay, but we want recent stuff, recent defined as within the last 2 years. These contracts, these people are at sea for 2 years. So your case is going to be automatically kicked out because your case of a trafficking human being is 3 or 4 years old. But the nature of the industry that person's working in, they're going to be offshore for 2 years. So there are fundamental interpretive flaws and threshold issues in how these agencies are implementing the tools on the table, that unless someone really pushes and fixes those, the best law in the books isn't going to get what it's supposed to do.
I'm going to raise some questions provided by others, starting with one from Congresswoman Wexton, who would like to have been here. And her question is for you, Mr. Urbina. And she asks, currently most Americans focus on where their fish is caught. For example, is it caught in Alaska or is it caught in Norway? Not about where they are processed, as in China or Russia Far East, and by whom. How do we make the complex supply chain more transparent so importers in the U.S. seafood industry understand that they are not violating the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act?
Yeah, I think seafood, again, is distinct from, tomatoes or cotton or computer chips in that it traverses these two universes. And so one big thing that has to happen intellectually in the public space is we need to not be talking about seafood as a marine issue, but be talking about seafood as a product that crosses land as well. And so I think, that's one big step. So environmental groups, Oceana, for example, or Greenpeace or Sea Shepherd or whatever, need to be really working more closely with Human Rights Watch and lawmakers who are focused on land issues more than they are now. Number two, I think the infrastructure that exists for the private sector to monitor and trace its supply chain also has to evolve a lot. And hopefully this will be a poke in that direction, in that they can no longer, I think, simply put forward that they're MSC certified or that they've been, sort of accredited as a good steward by a private entity, and therefore they're sort of part of the ocean conservation team. That's not enough anymore. I think there has to be much more involvement by seafood companies in the on land labor issues. And then lastly, I think Sally, really said it best. The definitional change in IUU to incorporate sea slavery or human rights issues is one big step. And then building on, as Bob and Sally have both said, SIMP, a flawed tool, but the one that's probably the most developed on the table. Building on SIMP, expanding it, redefining it, getting more agencies involved in it, is at least what I hear from experts is probably the best step for trying to get the supply chain of this product more under control.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Chair Smith would like a little bit more of information regarding how has China reacted to the reporting about forced labor in their seafood industry?
I'll answer that. So with a wall of silence, I mean, if you think of three big players that you would expect to respond to this reporting, one would be the market players, so seafood companies in Europe and the US. The second would be government players, meaning this government. And the third would be China. The history of the last 2 years of engaging with market players, and we put all of our interactions with all 300 companies up on our website, has been largely a wall of silence. Most of the big companies refuse to engage. A couple of exceptions engaged. Lunds is one example, where these are companies that didn't agree, didn't like what we were telling them, but were willing to converse and knew they were on record the whole time and pushed back at times, but were very open and trying to figure out how to fix these things. But the vast majority of market players did not. And I think that's a big problem because those who don't engage end up getting very little journalistic light on them because there's just this wall of silence from them. And those who do engage end up getting a lot more spotlight on them, even though they took the high road. In terms of the Chinese government, there have been a couple of comments coming out of the Overseas Fisheries Agency Association, essentially calling the story and the reporting fabricated. But there's something interesting in that response, which is, and this is something I think the public in the West needs to be mindful of, they elide definitions. So they are quick to point out, under our own laws, nothing illegal is happening here. This is not forced labor. These people are paid a wage. They're given vocational training and happy to have these jobs. That is, and it's all true, and it's all coming from the Chinese government, but it's irrelevant. And I think, luckily, the U.S. media and companies are understanding that that's irrelevant because of the category that is child labor, or prison labor, or North Korean labor, or Uyghur labor. That's point one. There have been market reactions since the reporting. So big companies have already begun severing ties to major factories in China. And so that's having clear financial repercussions in China. But that's about what we've seen.